Crooked River, Chapter 24. The next morning the sky poured rain. When I heard it on the roof as I was lying in bed, I nearly shouted for joy. There wouldn't be any trial beneath Mr. Perry's old tree. Not in the hard rain. But then Pa came stomping in while we were fixing breakfast and told us the trial would be held inside our cabin on account of the poor weather and because our log house was the biggest one. I couldn't keep a downcast look from crossing my face. Pa caught a glimpse of it and said he had best not ever see that look again. Hard work was what we did, and if we didn't want a thrashing, I had better help Laura get everything in order. I didn't dare to tell him that it wasn't the work I didn't want to do. After Pa left, I took some breakfast up to Indian John. He was sitting with his knees drawn up to his chest and his arms wrapped around them, staring into the shadows, as if he was thinking. I don't know if he understood what all the shuffling and noise meant below, but he didn't nod in my direction as he usually did. As I set down the plate of food, I noticed that his white blanket was crumpled in the middle of the loft floor. I figured that it had fallen off his shoulders while the men were putting him back in irons, and no one had cared to pick it up. Someone ought to show Amick one small kindness, I thought, no matter what happened at that miserable trial today. So I lifted up the white blanket from where it lay in a heap, shook the dust out of it, and folded it as neatly as one of our own bed quilts. Before I went back down the steps, I put the blanket beside his straw pallet and smoothed it with my hands. The blanket was wool with a band of red along the side, and I imagine it was important to him. It would have been important to me anyway. I didn't say a word to Laura about it when I came downstairs. With people already arriving, we had to hurry to move all our furnishings and such to the walls. By morning, folks were packed into our cabin so tightly that not a chink of air remained. They were crowded on our beds, and Lorenzo even perched on top of our flour barrel. Me and Laura settled in the farthest corner of the room behind all the water-soaked backs and heads. We sat on the top of our wooden chest so no other folks would use it as their seat. It made my heart pound to imagine what would happen if anybody stumbled upon the things we had hidden inside. What would they think if they opened the wooden cover and caught a glimpse of the beads and quills and such? From where we sat we could see Judge Noble, who was placed squarely in front of our fireplace, behind our dinner table. The jury was on the judge's left, crowded on chairs and stools in front of our food cupboards. The lawyers had the other side of the hearth to themselves. They sat in two of our good straight-backed chairs from the east, with our dried bunches of herbs dangling strangely above their heads. Indian John sat on the far side of Peter Kelly, nearly hidden in the cabin corner. The judge hammered his mallet on our table. "Come to order," he called out. I noticed that his hair was wet and unruly from the rain. He kept running his hand over the top of his wide forehead, trying to smooth away the lingering drops of water. "We are returning to the testimony of Blacksmith Nichols this morning," he said, clearing his throat, "and as planned, we will hear the questions of the lawyer, Mr. Kelly, today." From the side of the fireplace, Mr. Kelly stood up and walked toward the blacksmith Nichols, who was sitting in a chair beside the judge's table. Laura stared down at her fingers, knotting and unknotting them. A lump rose in my throat as I watched Peter Kelly square his thin shoulders and face the blacksmith. His copper-red hair was combed neatly, I noticed, and he wore a vest and shirt that looked newly made. But seeing those things made my heart ache even more. How would it feel to be in his shoes, I wondered, having to defend the life of a person who was once your friend? For Mr. Kelly's sake, may something go well, I prayed, just one small thing. "Good morning, Mr. Nichols," the lawyer said in a quiet voice. "I only have a few questions." Even those simple words made the crowd mock him in low whispers. Beside me, Laura shook her head. Mr. Kelly didn't seem to pay the whispers any mind. He held up the striped tomahawk again. "You made this tomahawk for the Indian called Indian John, am I correct?" Nichols rolled his eyes and gave a sigh loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I already said that to the lawyer yesterday, if you was listening." "Answer the question Mr. Kelly asked you," the judge warned. "Yes," the blacksmith's voice rumbled. "Answer ain't no different than yesterday's yes." "Thank you," Peter Kelly said, setting the tomahawk on the corner of the judge's table. He walked across the room to fetch something from a sack beside his chair. I raised my head to see what he was doing. He held up a small hatchet with a wood handle, the kind most of the men carried, not much different than the tomahawk except for its plain handle. "I'm just curious, Mr. Nichols," Peter Kelly said. "How about this hatchet? Do you recollect making this one?" He handed it to the blacksmith. "Go on, take a closer look at it." A peculiar expression passed across Nicholas's face. He took the hatchet from Mr. Kelly. He gazed at it for a good long while, turning it over and over in his big hands and running his thumb along the side of the blade, and then he said, "Nope, it ain't one of mine." "You're certain," Mr. Kelly repeated, "this isn't the one you made in the fall of last year for Reverend Doan?" Reverend Doan was a Methodist circuit preacher who came through from time to time. I could tell by the way Mr. Kelly asked the question that the hatchet surely belonged to the minister, but I didn't see what Reverend Doan's hatchet had to do with anything. "I said it ain't one of mine," Nichols warned. "This one." Mr. Kelly held up another plain hatchet, and the blacksmith didn't even look at it and just kept his eyes on Mr. Kelly's face and said, "It ain't mine." "How about this one? Certainly you will recognize this one." Mr. Kelly held up another tomahawk. It was striped with scorch marks like Indian John's pipe tomahawk, but it had 2 silver bands around it, and a pewter-looking piece on the end of the handle. "Tell the jury which Indian this belongs to, Mr. Nichols. Certainly you remember." My heart thudded inside me as I watched Nichols' face grow darker by the minute. "Perhaps you'll remember the owner of this one." As Mr. Kelly reached for another tomahawk, the blacksmith jumped up suddenly and raged. "I ain't answering no more of your questions, you skinny little cuss." The judge stood up and pounded his mallet, but Nichols didn't pay it any mind. "Maybe I don't know every damn savage I made a tomahawk for," he roared in Mr. Kelly's drawn and fearful face. "But sure as the devil is in hell, I know the one I made for that savage," he pointed at Indian John, "and I dare any man in this room to call me a liar to my face," he bellowed. "You go on and have your court of fools, but I am done answering questions. Done." He plowed through the crowd of people, pushing a woman and a little toddling child out of his path as he thundered out of our cabin. After the door closed behind him, the whole room was as still as the woods after a windstorm. The only sound was the rain hammering down on the roof shingles. "The court calls a rest for an hour," the judge said, breaking the silence, "and we shall discuss how to continue with the testimony." I think everyone was startled when Mr. Kelly spoke up. No, he said, walking toward the judge. "Proceed with the next witness." He waved his hand in the direction of the door. "My questions for the blacksmith were complete. I only wanted to point out," Mr. Kelly glanced at the jurymen, "the outright lies and untruths of Mr. Nichols' testimony about the tomahawk, Your Honor." He said the words "lies and untruths" loud enough and slow enough for everybody in the whole room to hear. The other lawyer jumped up to raise an objection to Peter Kelly's statement, but the judge held up a hand to silence him. "No," he said impatiently. "We will just proceed." As the judge wrote something down, I could hear an angry hum fill the room. It sounded like a nest of bees. I don't think anyone was too pleased with the new direction the trial had suddenly taken, or with the words "lies and untruths." In front of us, Mr. Perry swore loudly. "If they find that savage innocent, I'll take up my gun and kill him myself. You just watch me." Heads nodded all around him. My mind tossed and turned, trying to understand what I'd heard. Blacksmith Nichols had sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, hadn't he? I remembered his big hand resting on the judge's Bible, and all the fierce nods and yes sirs, but I couldn't see how he was able to recollect Indian John's tomahawk clearly, and none of the others. And why had Peter Kelly's question sent him into a wild rage? Was this whole story nothing but lies? Up in the front of the hearth, the third witness sank down in the chair. He had appeared to be about the age of my pa, but he was more scrawny. One of his thin shoulders stuck up higher than the other, which gave him an odd, crooked appearance. The judge's voice called for order. "We will now hear the testimony of Mr. Ezra Phelps," he announced. "Mr. Root, you may begin your questions."